Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Robel Alemu. I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts University in the Economics and Public Policy program. I'm actually in the just came into the job market. Just to make note of that. So this work is with Professor Lauren Schmidt here in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Is part of my one of my dissertation work, and it looks at the gene environment effects of cigarette taxes, looking at the entire life course on smoking behavior, and also effects on health conditions during old age. So to just motivate the study, so we know that smoking has been indicated to be a leading cause of days, preventable days especially, throughout the world. It's responsible for over 7 million days globally per year. And in the US, about 500,000 people die of smoking-related morbidities. So smoking, very many studies have shown that smoking increases the risk of a wide range of diseases, many cancers, lung disease, heart conditions, stroke, and diabetes as well. So according to the Department of Human Health and Services, the economic burden associated with the smoking is estimated to be over $330 billion a year in the US. So you can see how much the magnitude of this burden is. So a wide range of these studies have actually found that smoking is a really complex behavioral trait that's influenced by so many factors, some environmental, some also related with genetic predisposition, and potentially some interaction between gene and the environment. So I'll talk a little bit about potential differences between gene-environment interactions and gene-environment correlations. And one of the contributions of this study is basically parsing out that difference by basically using exogenous measure of E, which I will talk about what that measure is, but sort of adds to the literature by measuring environment using exogenous variable. So to just show you what are some of the policy instruments that have been implemented so far. One, and the most popular being cigarette taxes that are imposed on purchases, have been widely adopted here in the US and worldwide. And other policies are to do with stringent policies to do with the minimum age of cigarette purchases, and also smoke-free air laws in public and private places as well. And in the US, prices, especially in the past 50 years, have increased substantially, especially in the past 20 years. Average price, median price rose from 30 cents a pack to about $6 a pack in the past 50 years. And most of this increase, as you can see, is a very recent phenomena. So in these policies, especially higher cigarette taxes associated, and also other associated stringent policies, have led to a decline in the consumption of cigarette, especially adult smoking prevalence have declined by about 30 percentage points since 1965. However, we noticed that the rate of this decline has been slowing and have stalled in the past 20 years. And this decline, when you look at distributions of this decline, it's not uniformly distributed. So across demographic groups, socioeconomic groups, and other groups as well. So these the mechanism behind these, stability in response to cigarette taxes, and also differences across different socioeconomic groups or demographies, is not quite understood. So this paper looks at whether genetic predisposition, which is one of the factors that's known to influence smoking behavior, moderates the efficacy of cigarette taxes. So that's the major contribution. And we also test whether demand responses to cigarette taxes vary by time of tax exposure. So whether individuals have been exposed to higher taxes during early years, teenage years, versus during old age. So we try to parse out differences of demand responses during these two different important periods. So because we know that most people initiate smoking early on during their teenage years. So changes in taxes during that period would plausibly have a much higher effect. So we use data from the HRS and also exploit state year variation in cigarette excise taxes. And for a measure of genetic predisposition, we use a polygenic risk index specifically developed for smoking initiation, of initiating smoking, and other one specifically developed for heavy smoking. So looking at differences in number of cigarettes smoked per day. The other major objective of this study is basically to get around of the issue of endogeneity of smoking behavior by using instrumental variable approach and understanding the impact of smoking, plausibly causal impact of smoking on disease condition, especially later during old age. We actually test for robustness of our effects estimated to model choice. What are the key findings? So we find that a % increase in adolescent taxes decreases smoking initiation by 8.3%, and taxes in old age seems to be less effective. We find that individuals with higher genetic predisposition to smoking, to initiate smoking, are likely to initiate smoking when they are exposed to higher cigarette taxes during adolescence, but not during old age. So old age, we're referring to cigarette exposure while individuals are in the HRS. So it's not entirely the entire adulthood period, but it's just like right from where they start to be in the HRS up to the latest wave. And we also find adolescent excise taxes are more effective relative to taxes in old age in terms of discouraging lifetime smoking. So in terms of magnitude, we find that a standard deviation increase in a smoking PGI. Mind you, we standardize the PGI measure and compute the Z-scores to be able to improve, to make it easier for interpretation. So we find the standard deviation increase in smoking PGI is linked to 6.9% versus a 2.4% decrease in the probability of an individual becoming a current smoker for those exposed to adolescent taxes versus old age taxes. So you see the difference in terms of like exposure timing, how that sort of impacts like the impact on smoking behavior. And we also find that the effect of cigarette taxes on smoking intensity do not vary by PGI for cigarettes smoked per day. So this is true for both cigarette taxes experienced during the adolescent years and also during old age. So these are the key findings, and a bit more is looking at the impact of smoking on disease conditions later in life. So we find that being a current smoker increases the likelihood of lung disease by 44.3%, decreases the average of lung function, which is measured objectively here by taking the peak expiratory flow by about 150 liters per minute. And we find that being a current smoker increases the likelihood of heart disease by 30.5%. So when we compare, these estimates are based on an instrumental variable approach, basically using cigarette taxes and also genetic predisposition as instruments to look at impacts of smoking on these outcomes. But when we look at like estimates that use just the naive oil-less, we see that the oil-less is downward biased, especially for lung function and disease by a factor of 2, and for heart disease by 28 percentage points. So let me just highlight for like few of the prior work that has been done in this space, especially the G by E space. So we know that twin studies and other recent studies have shown that smoking behavior is highly heritable, ranging from 30 to 60%. Especially recent advances in genome-wide association studies have indicated that there are certain genetic variants that are significantly associated with smoking behavior, both in the intensive and the extensive margin. About 500 variants have been identified so far to be linked with smoking behavior. So these genetic variants, although this is the mechanism behind these variants or genes is not like entirely understood. There are some studies indicating that they dictate how rapidly nicotine is metabolized in individuals, or they also influence the production of certain neurotransmitters and receptors as well. So this is an active area of research. So some studies have actually looked at differential effects of demand responses to cigarette taxes by specifically looking at these genetic variants and found some effects, but follow-up studies such as Fontana have failed to replicate these findings. And one of the major issues with variant-based analysis is they have low power relative to genome-wide association studies that actually look at the entire genome and try to find SNPs that are correlated with these traits. So a recent study by Slob and Retveld have documented like a potential G by E interaction effect by looking at the effects of cigarette taxes, like using cigarette taxes as an exogenous measure of the environment, and using polygenic risk index as a measure of genetic predisposition, and find that those with high PGI are less likely to smoke and also smoke heavily. So I highlighted that how PGI sort of offers this advantage of explaining a much larger share of the variation of these genetic traits relative to a candidate gene or individual SNPs-based approaches. So our work advances previous work in a couple of different ways. One being that we differentiate, especially compared to the very recent work by Slob and co-author, we differentiate between timing of exposure. So we look at exposure during adolescence, which is really critical in terms of initiation. And also we look at cigarette taxes experienced while in the HRS. And we use a more predictive smoking PGI, very recently released by addressing some issues with like excluding, so the recent PGI sort of excludes the discovery sample, like the HRS, like, and look at a really large number of cohorts across the world for the discovery of these SNPs, and exclude HRS and then while computing the PGI. So these improves have been shown to improve the accuracy of the PGI in terms of explaining the variability of smoking behavior. So we use that as opposed to the recent Slob paper. And we additionally compute the plausibly causal effects of smoking using an IV approach. IV, the instrumental variables being cigarette taxes and PGI. And another contribution in this regard is also accounting for potential tax avoidance behavior by price-sensitive smokers. So there are a couple of studies that have indicated that some smokers, price-sensitive, especially smokers, tend to avoid higher taxes by traveling to the nearest lower tax state. So we sort of use some proxy measures of like time traveled to a nearest lower tax state. So we use that to sort of account for potential biases associated with like tax avoidance behavior. So this is one of the contributions. And we also show results that are robust to like model choices, a wide range of models. So the main aim of this study is to test whether demand responses to cigarette taxes vary by PGI. And we test whether demand responses to cigarette taxes, basically elasticities, are sensitive to timing of tax exposure. And we also account for G by E effects here. And we estimate a plausibly causal effect of smoking on health condition at older ages. So I will talk a little bit about the data, but I won't delve too much deeper because of the earlier presentation have actually looked at how PGIs are constructed and what those mean. But I'll just talk about the sort of data set that we bring together. So one is the cigarette taxes data, which is based on tax burden on tobacco data set. We adjust for inflation using the consumer price index and use the base year of 1991 to account for inflation. And we use an aggregate measure of tax exposure. So for instance, in this case, when you look at tax exposure during adolescent period, what we do is basically take a simple average of the cigarette excise tax that an individual was exposed to from year when they were like 10 years to 18 years of age. So this is how we construct an average exposure while individuals are adolescents. We basically follow a very similar step, except adjusting for the period that we're looking at tax exposure while in the HRS. So basically the same approach. So this is like a single measure, a time invariant measure of exposure, but a time that's really critical in terms of differentiating between exposure in teenage years versus during old age. The other main data that we rely on is the health and retirement study, of course. This is a longitudinal survey of older adults above 50 and above, have been taking place biannually since 1992. And since 2006, it includes biomarker data, genetic data, and recently epigenetic data as well. So we define smoking behavior here based on both extensively and intensively. In the extensive margin, an individual is a never smoker if they have self-reported to have smoked at least 100 cigarettes in their life. Current smokers, of course, whether they are still smoking, they have not quitted at this old age. And the other intensive measure is the number of cigarettes smoked per day. And for former smokers, this is based on self-reported number of cigarettes smoked during peak consumption period. So how much they have smoked when they smoked the most. Of course, the HRS also includes smoking-related disease variables, which I'll talk a bit more later, and in other covariates as well. In terms of the PGI, we know the PGI sort of summarizes genetic information across the entire genome, basically looking at variations at like millions of SNPs that are known to be significantly associated with smoking behavior. So it's sort of combining the additive influence of each significant SNP. And for each SNP, an individual can have a genotype of 0, 1, 2 based on the copy of the reference allele. So GWAS basically estimates the strength of the association between YI is the outcome of interest, in our case is smoking behavior, and GIM is basically the genotype, whether 0, 1, or 2, and the gamma here is the additive effect of a given genotype or SNP. And this model also controls for covariates such as age and sex and things like that. So basically, the PGI, an index, basically is computed by aggregating a weighted average aggregate of the effect sizes of each SNP. So depending on how powerful the effect of a given SNP is, that's given different weights. So this is how the PGI sort of aggregates the measure. So we do use like different PGIs for initiation and for smoking intensity, for number of cigarettes smoked per day. Standardize the PGI by computing Z-scores. Higher scores reflect higher predisposition. To avoid potential biases of population stratification, we restrict samples to European ancestry, and we also control for the first 10 principal components of the relationship metrics. Other control variables include tobacco control policies. We rely on the Impact Teens project and also supplement that with data from the Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation. And in terms of proxying for tax avoidance, as I was mentioning earlier, there are studies that show that about 13 to 25% of cigarettes that are purchased like of all the total purchase, about this much percent is purchased from a lower tax state. So we do have strong evidence suggesting that tax avoidance may bias some of these relationships between tax state and smoking behavior. So we proxy that by computing the travel time. So we look at the travel time from a centroid of a county that an individual lives to the nearest border, lower cigarette excise tax state, and use that as a proxy for potential tax avoidance behavior. And we use ArcGIS tools to be able to compute the travel time. So here's the estimation strategy. So we sort of follow like two approaches. One, looking at outcome in the extensive margin, whether someone smokes, is a never smoker or a current smoker. And the other one is the intensive margin, conditional on someone being a smoker. And we have here SIST is basically a binary variable for an individual I residing in state S and interviewed in year T, whether they have smoked or not. And tax, as I was mentioning, is these state-level cigarette excise tax that are aggregates, so that they're not like year-specific measures here. So because we're interested in like specific periods of an individual's life, these are like aggregated for teenage years and old age. And we do also control for individual and state-level variables. Our coefficients of interest here are alpha 3 and beta 3 here, which basically estimate the differential demand responses to cigarette taxes by PGI. So sort of like if we have like a significant effect on these coefficients, providing some evidence for a G by E interaction effect, not a G by E correlation effect, because we rely on a plausibly exogenous measure of E, which is cigarette taxes. And we run linear probability models and robust oil-less models to ease estimating and interpreting interaction terms, especially. So we rely on these models. The second part of the study looks at the impacts of smoking on disease outcomes. We run a two-stage least square model, basically instrumenting smoking behavior, both in the intensive and extensive margin, by different instrumental variables. So we try out a couple of different options. One, just using cigarette taxes. The other one, potentially exploiting the interaction between cigarette tax and genetic predisposition. So we test out like how effective our first stage is when we add more variables to that. And the second stage basically looks at the impact on a disease outcome of interest. We model most of the models we collapse the longitudinal data by respondents' unique ID because we see that most of our like dependent variables and the key predictor variables are time invariant. So we can think of smoking behavior. It varies little because these are observed, individuals are observed post, like during old age. So smoking behavior likely does not change at that time. Most people initiate smoking earlier. And PGI, of course, is fixed at birth by definition. Cigarette taxes, we intentionally define them like as aggregates, so they're not like time varying. And tobacco control policies change really little over time and can be captured by the aggregation method that we use. So for robustness, besides these cross-sectional models, we actually also run pooled OLS and also panel data models, and the results are robust to that. So in the pooled OLS, we actually control for autocorrelation by clustering at the individual and state level. So here's like a basic descriptive of the HRS. So as you can see here, we see that smokers are less educated, more likely to be veterans, live in state with, and also likely to live in state with lower cigarette taxes and less stringent tobacco control policies. And we compare here like the full sample, current smokers, never smokers, and the difference between the two. As you can see here, we have a large percent of participants have reported smoking at some point in their life. And on average, in the full sample, about 1.5 cigarette per day, while in the current smokers, it's about 17 cigarettes per day. And we see like important differences here that I have highlighted here. So one of the key findings that we report here is that, so we show differences with results like by exposure during adolescence and while in the HRS. So we find that adolescent taxes are slightly more effective, as you can see here. And we find that higher PGI, individuals with higher PGI are less likely to smoke in response to adolescent taxes, but this is not the case when we look at tax exposure while in the, so we don't find a significant interaction effect here when we use tax exposure while in the HRS for the probability of someone becoming an ever smoker. And in this case, we do control for a wide range of state level tobacco control policies, and also travel time to the nearest lower tax state fixed effects, core fixed effects as well. So you can interpret this because like the excise tax variable is measured log transformed, so percent change in cigarette tax, state level cigarette taxes sort of is associated with like a 8.3% decrease in someone becoming an ever smoker. So the major coefficient of interest is the interaction term here, as you can see. So we run similar models, but here this time around we look at current smoking behavior. So like never quitters, the likelihood of someone still to report smoking at this old age. So we find that adolescent cigarette taxes are more effective relative to taxes in old age in terms of discouraging lifetime smoking behavior. So you can see here a more stronger evidence for a G by E effect in terms of someone becoming or reporting to have not quit smoking at old age. So both are statistically significant for both during adolescence and during HRS, unlike the one that you saw earlier about someone reporting becoming an ever smoker. Visuals, I think, are much better. So we sort of show these by highest versus lowest quartile cigarette tax exposure. So and show results by the PGI for smoking initiation. And we clearly see here that respondents with higher PGI who reside in a state with the lowest cigarette, so the ones in green are those living in the low cigarette taxes, like the lowest quartile, are less likely to quit smoking. So these are true for both adolescent taxes and taxes while in the HRS. When we look at the effects in the intensive margin, so in the number of cigarettes smoked per day, so we find that, as you can see here, like contemporaneous taxes seem to be more effective in reducing heavy smoking, and the effects of cigarette taxes on smoking intensity do not seem to vary by the PGI, unlike the one that we saw in the intensive margin. So we don't find statistically significant G by E effect when we look at the number of cigarettes smoked per day. So, but in terms of like the cigarette taxes, while in the HRS, we do still see that the number of cigarettes smoked per day in response to a unit increase, a percent increase in cigarette taxes, while in the while they were adolescent and while in the HRS is quite high and highly significant. The second part of our study looks at the impacts on smoking on disease outcomes, and we see here compare results of naive OLS versus a two-stage least square that we model, and look at likelihood of developing lung disease in old age, and also use a more objective measure of lung function, which is the peak expiratory flow, which is basically taken an average. So the HRS asks like individuals to sort of measure like the maximum expiratory airflow, 3 measures. So we take averages of those and sort of see the effects on this objectively measured proxy of lung function. And we see here clearly that smoking hurts lung function and increases the likelihood of lung disease. And estimates of the OLS are downward biased relative to the OLS, to the two-stage least square model. And we also look at the impacts of the intensive margin, basically the number of cigarettes smoked per day, on disease outcomes. And we see here that, so if we agree on like cigarettes per day to be a proxy for heavy smoking, we see that heavy smoking hurts lung function and increases the likelihood of lung disease. And similarly, OLS is downward biased. And we also look at like beyond these, we also look at other diseases that are smoking related, mostly reported. So we still find really that smoking increases the likelihood of like heart problem, someone reporting to have been diagnosed by like with any cancer, diabetes, and here also the OLS consistently downward biased. And we also provide some statistics related to the first stage. We do have a very strong first stage. So let me just conclude by highlighting some of the key findings here. In this study, we test for potential heterogeneous or differential effects, differential demand response to cigarette excise taxes by genetic variation in genetic predisposition to smoking. And we find that genetic predisposition to smoking moderates the effect of cigarette taxes on smoking initiation, but not in intensity. So a bit different from what the SLOP paper finds, but in the SLOP paper there's no differentiation between like adolescent cigarette exposure versus old age cigarette exposure. So this is some quite interesting differences between the two. And we find that those exposed to higher taxes are more likely to quit by old age. And the G by E effect seems to be more pronounced when taxes were experienced during adolescence. So higher taxes both during adolescence and during old age, we find that they are linked with less smoking, both in the intensive and extensive margin. The instrumental variable approach that we use to get around potential issues with endogeneity of smoking, because smoking could be correlated with like factors that are related to other comorbidities with smoking. So to get around that, we use the instrumental variable approach, and this approach sort of establishes strong effects of smoking on disease outcomes. And comparing that with a basic OLS model shows that OLS is downward biased. The evidence for the G by E effect of cigarette taxes across the life course is important, because in terms of the implication for policy and programs and understanding the most impactful measures and policies in tackling smoking, both in terms of like discouraging smoking initiation to begin with, and also encouraging quitting. So with this, I'd like to close today's presentation. Thank you so much. We're welcome to take questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much again for having me. This was a great paper, as you can tell from the presentation. I didn't realize it was a dissertation, but I should have, on how complete everything is in there. And it's, it's one of those that as a reviewer, you love and hate because there's nothing to say about it. But it's a very complete and well done paper. And this is what I took away when taxes tax teens, and they won't smoke. Beautiful thing. And it does matter your genetics, right? So that more, the higher genetic likelihood of initiating, the more responsive you are to taxes when you're a teen. And it made a lot of intuitive sense to me when reading this. Initiation is more sensitive to teens than when you're adult, but volume is actually more sensitive to current prices, right? Which makes, you're measuring volume and how heavy of a smoker you are now, and the price that you're paying now makes a lot of sense. That it would be responsive to that. And I think for me, I was really at first struggling with this. Genetically predisposed people are more responsive to taxes than those who aren't, and trying to figure out the mechanism as to how that happens. You really need forward-looking teenagers to know that they're genetically predisposed to want to smoke. And how does this go? So I think a little discussion in the paper would be helpful, just to let people who aren't geneticists know how this actually works fundamentally, because I think once I got to these graphs, I think it made a lot more sense to me. But when I was first looking at the interaction terms and stuff in the regression, I was kind of struggling with how the underlying mechanism it would be. And I took away, and you can tell me if this is the right thing to think about, but what I took away is essentially raising taxes depresses, especially in this type of figure, depresses demand across the spectrum. And it just was more effective among those who are the most likely to initiate anyway. And I was wondering if you could, one, does this really have to be linear? Because I know that the standard errors are merged over here, but ideally, I think this is actually a curve over here, and I think you're forcing it to be linear. And then the other question is, from this type of analysis, can you get at what type of tax regime would level it out? And would leveling out the demand actually be a good thing? Is that what we're actually trying to do with the taxes? And does the tax regime tell us that? Again, just some questions for your next paper, or in your elevator talk, when I'm sure that there'll be interested people that want to talk to you and have crazy questions for you to make conversation. And then I think you might get some pushback again from the non-genetics people. Are we really sure that smoking PGIs are not related to the health outcomes directly? Why is it that they're more price sensitive? And is it that we should be thinking about it that way? Are these valid instruments? I think from an email exchange, he does include the PGIs directly in the equation. So it's really just the G by E that's in the instruments, but still, I think a little more exploration, maybe using a PGI that has nothing to do with smoking might be helpful as a falsification test, and just kind of showing that we really do think that this is about smoking and not about lung function at late in life. And then I think something that I was kind of struggling with too is, who is the late now? So who is in this instrument? Who is the local average treatment effect really appropriate to think about? So if it was just the taxes, you can just think about it, people who happen to live in high tax regimes when they were teenagers, okay, that makes sense to me. But now we also have this interaction term with people who are genetically likely to initiate smoking and in high tax regimes. And what does that mean from a policy perspective, or who is this, or how representative this is, or who is in the late? And so how generalizable are these findings? I think because it's something that a lot of economists aren't used to thinking about, sort of a little bit more explanation in that would be helpful to make the job market talk more accessible broadly when you're doing it. And then there is one, maybe two sentences in the paper about survivorship bias. You are looking at an older cohort with, in the HRS who, if you were a heavy smoker, you might not have made it to the HRS. And so I think developing that a little bit more, maybe in the limitations, or really how much you think this is influencing this and your results, I think would be helpful. Again, just to kind of, dot all your I's and cross all your T's. But otherwise, I think this is an amazing paper. I think you're going to have a great time on the job market because it's everyone's favorite time. But I think that this is a very strong paper, and you all should hire it. Okay, thank you.